Well, we are only 1 week into 2026 and the AI takeovers are continuing. Now, if you haven't seen this yet, Jason Lemkin, who's the CEO of a company called SaaStr's, he's known as the Godfather of SaaS, is on record and he's all over the place. I saw it on Business Insider after he replaced his 10-person sales team with a handful of AI agents. Now, I will say half of my LinkedIn feed is cheering about the efficiency and benefits that are going to come from this bold move. The other half is terrified or outraged at the reckless use of AI. Now, in both cases, I would say both those extremes are reacting emotionally. And my goal today is to talk this through and hopefully have all of us think about this and react strategically. So I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focused. And this week, we're going to do an autopsy of this AI takeover because this one isn't about a future prediction of what may happen, where AI might be going. This is something that did happen. It's already live. It's in motion right now. And this one in particular is an extremely high profile one to examine when it comes to this whole rip and replace, because Jason is the Godfather of SaaS, whatever that means. But the reality is he's got this huge community of business startup founders and things like that he works with. And so him doing this, going on record saying, this is the way I've done this, it's going to be great, all these things, means that there's like 10,000 other founders that are listening to this, hearing this and going, I mean, if our leader is saying this is the path forward, then maybe this is the same path that we should be walking. And to be fair, as we get into this, there are some things that I want to point out that I think he did do well. And there's some real components of this that are worth paying attention to. And I also want to point out where I think there are some huge mistakes that happen here, and that I do not think this is going to end well for him or his organization. And hopefully in that can help better prepare you for the decisions you're going to need to make, whether you're the CEO of a company or an individual trying to make sense of this world that we're in right now. Now, before we get into it, if you benefit from my content, if you enjoy it, would you do me a huge favor? It would mean the world to me if you liked and subscribed. If you know somebody who would benefit from conversations like this, from content like this, please share it with them. And if you so feel inclined and go, Christopher, I would love to take you out to lunch or buy you a coffee, you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind. It would mean the world to me. All right. So let's get into this. Let's break this down because it's important to understand what happened. It's more than just, there's some details behind this. Now, the fact is this whole thing was initiated based on 2 of his top performing sales reps quitting during SaaStr's annual. Okay, this was like the Super Bowl of their year, the prime time for their sales folks, all this stuff. And he had 2 of his top people walk out. And I really do empathize with that, because if we were to sit in his shoes at this, the stress of that event, you stack on top of that your top talent literally just walking out in the middle of it. And so you can understand the emotion behind this and where a founder, somebody would go, we're never going to let this happen again. And it's in those vulnerable moments. It was an emotional decision that was backed by logic. There was some real logic behind, hey, this really put us in a bind. We cannot have that happen again. And so I empathize with that, and I can understand how someone would make a decision like that when that kind of thing pops up. And I think that's one of the dangers when it comes to AI is it can seem like a really reasonable solution in a moment like this. Because when he breaks the math down, and he says in the article, as he started looking at what it was going to cost to replace these folks, and then also, the timeline and how compelling AI agents were, the fact there was no downtime, all this other stuff, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing. Now, the part I'm not going to get into because I don't have the details and whatever, but I think there's a lot to say here. When you look at how much he was looking at spending on replacing his top talent and the fact that 2 walked out in their Super Bowl, I think there are some things going on at this organization that probably are larger contributors to it that we're not addressing. But that's not the conversation for today's episode. But that's what happened, and you can emphasize with that. So what he did was he worked with his chief AI officer, and they came up with their AI team. Okay, now they did this. They actually broke it down. They had artisan that they named Ava. They had one agent for outbound type sales stuff, and then they had a inbound sales agent called Piper, and it was for handling leads as they actually came in. So they actually broke it down into 2 different kinds of agents. And this thing was a custom GPT. I don't remember which actual AI platform, but they actually built this on their own proprietary data. And really what they did was they took his blog and they said, here is Jason and all of his historical data on how he's talked about the company and everything he's dealt with. Let's take all that proprietary data. Let's bring it in. Let's build our own AI tool. And then let's turn this over. And again, they differentiated based on how they were going to do it. And so they didn't just automate sales per se. They specialized agents. They created specialized sales agents for this. And so that's the context. That's what happened in this situation. Now, it's worth noting, let's transition over to some of the good, because it is worth noting that there are some things that I think there's some real wisdom here that anybody can walk away from. The first one is this. I have to give Jason credit for doing what I would call the attrition audit. And what I mean by that is he had 2 of his top salespeople walk out at, a really catastrophic moment, and he brought AI in. He didn't fire his sales team. He didn't say we're going to bring in AI and we're going to do this. So he waited for natural attrition, not ideal, the way it came, but he waited for attrition, and he audited it. He said, all right, let's actually look at the real pickle this put us in, and let's think about it. Let's think strategically about it. Now, I may not agree with the path he took, but there was some thought and strategy behind this. Many leaders, when they lose someone, are just so quick to run out and just go, let's get a warm body and put it in. And that's not what happened here. And I think that is a win that is worth highlighting. Like I said, we can argue about whether that was the right choice. I don't think that the path they took was the best path, but the fact they didn't just run out and say, we had salespeople, let's go get, version 2.0 of these 2 individuals that we lost. That is a model of surgical leadership that is worth applauding and saying, hey, well done. Could have maybe used a little help, as you were thinking through that. There definitely still was some emotional reactions happening there, but it's worth saying, well done on actually auditing the roles that you lost before backfilling. That is a win. That is a win there. The second win that I think is worth noting is, as I dug into how they went about the agents, they did actually deconstruct the workflow versus just saying, let's train a agent on the job. Okay. And if you remember what I said was there's 2 different agents. There was the outbound and the inbound. And I think they were messing around with a couple other ones, but that was all based on actually looking at, and they're quoted on saying this, which I have a separate opinion on this, but they took 6 weeks of actual data from their top reps. They followed them. They looked at what they did, and they actually trained this on that. And so they actually deconstructed the workflows. What were people actually doing? They didn't just take a job description and build an agent around, some database of job descriptions and say, hey, actually just do this job. They actually said, what is the work that gets done? And I will say, That is a win on this. In many AI, transformations, that's not what happens. There's this drudgery trap where people don't really want to peel back the rock and look at some of the bugs underneath it and say, like, what are people actually working on? They just go, wouldn't it just be easier to pull a job description, a JD, and build an agent around that? That sounds easier. And so kudos to Jason and team for saying, let's actually examine the work they do. The emailing that happens, the scheduling, the different FAQs, the questions that come in. Like, let's see where there's high volumes of work and let's actually organize it. Let's organize it into workflows that we can look at. And in many ways, that's where AI performs well. So again, we got to acknowledge the wins where they exist. And I would say that's one worth noting. Now, the third one was, looking at the fact, and I understand where this is coming from, and it did come out through the interview, that recognizing AI is, I won't say it's unbiased, but it doesn't have the same kind of biases that humans do. And what I mean by that is when you think about AI as it relates to sales type activities, AI agents, they're not cherry picking leads. Okay. Now, if you've ever worked in sales or you've worked with sales teams, you know how it can be easy to not want to work certain leads. You're just like, these are bad leads. I don't want to spend the time here. I don't. And many times you're missing real opportunity because of personal biases. And AI is unbiased in that sense. If you say, here's a book of leads, it's just going to go at those book of leads. It's going to go after all of them. It's not going to go, well, I don't really want to call this. I don't want to do this. If you say go through all these, it's going to do it. And I think that is one area that agents work really well, is they will work the full pipe that you put in front of them, which means there's not the leakage that you often find in a human sales team where you go, how have we not called this entire book of business? Well, we decided we didn't really want to call them. It wasn't a good use of our time. Based on what? Well, you don't have that. And that's why my goal in this is not to say, keep AI out of sales. That is not by the time we get to the end of this, and if you followed me for long, my objective is not to discourage the use of AI. It's to say, let's use it surgically, because in this example of the ego-free queue, AI will not discriminate. It'll go after whatever you put in front of it, which can be a double-edged sword, but nonetheless, that's a real benefit to it. So it's worth highlighting those things as wins, because they are wins. And I don't want to just overly play that, this was just a huge mistake. It's going to go horribly wrong and don't do anything that they did. They made some smart plays, but I want to talk about what I would consider the misses, the things that I think many organizations that I talk to and work with who are pursuing similar paths are vulnerable to follow if they're not careful. And if you're part of his community and you're one of these 10,000 founders who's listening to what Jason is saying, slow down, take it off 1.5x speed and pay attention here, because this is the part that is really important. Now, there's three that I really want to focus on. We could spend the entire day talking about this if we really wanted to, but I want to narrow it down. Now, the first one is this. There's this whole survivor bias that's baked in, at least from what I can tell by this. And what I mean by that is, if you look in how he went about this, he openly talks about the fact that he and his chief AI officer focused on training their agents on the workflows of their top performers. And let me say, I understand why people would inherently go, isn't that a good thing? Why would you want to train AI on bad data? And I'm not necessarily saying you bake bad data into this, but this is where this survivor bias, the data blindness that comes with going, well, let's just only look at the top performers, is if you don't take time to study and understand your bottom performers, you don't actually know why those deals were lost. And this is a critical mistake when it comes to, I've worked with a lot of sales teams over the years where we've had to do deep analysis on what's actually going on in the sales pipeline and why are things falling apart. And it's often not for the things you think. Now, I would also say all this information wasn't available. These are questions I would ask if I was closer to it. I also don't know how they defined top performers. Because if you just say top performers in terms of what, closed the most deals, generated the most revenue, anybody who's been around sales knows that there's a lot of shady behavior that often comes along with those top performers. And I can't say for sure, but was that accounted for? And so when I hear that they trained it only on their top performers, that raises a red flag for me in the fact that you have data blindness here. You have not actually objectively looked at the whole of a sales organization to understand how your pipeline's flowing. What are people doing to be high performers? Are you taking that into an account? And top performers, here's the other thing. Top performers often succeed despite the process. They're not thriving. Top salespeople are usually top salespeople no matter where you put them. And it's because of, it's not just because, well, we've got the best sales process type of a thing. You can't code the charisma and the network and the skills that often come from a top sales performer. And so if you're only looking at the workflows of a top sales performer, I could tell you from my GE days, if you were to look at the workflows of some of the top sales performers, their workflows were definitely not the things you wanted to replicate necessarily. They were busy selling deals, not putting stuff in Salesforce. And I'm not saying Salesforce isn't an important thing. I'm just saying the way they worked wasn't necessarily something you would want to replicate, especially not in an AI agent that is going to do exactly what it is told to do. So not only do you have this combination of you only really analyzed the top half of your performance, which, like I said, I don't even know how you defined top performance. That's another conversation all in and all of itself. But let's assume that that was done well. You only looked at this half, not taking into account the human contextual component of, are your top performers and their workflows necessarily the things that you want to follow? What gaps is that going to open up? You also, like I said, don't understand, well, why were your bottom performers? Were there things that actually maybe you did want, type of a thing? And that was missed. Okay. My second critique on what they did is is a little bit of the narcissistic error that comes in with this. And if you look at the way they built and trained the agents, Jason cloned himself is what he did. He built a sales organization of a bunch of copies of him. They took his blog and they said, here's how Jason responds to everything. Here's how Jason thinks. Here's how Jason talks. Let's take Jason and let's apply him in these different workflows. And this is really a founder's trap. This is something I see that pops up a lot, not just in founders, but in senior leaders in general, which is like, if everybody was just me, we'd win all the time because I'm a winner. So if I was all over the place doing everything, then that's great. It'll be even greater because there's 10 times the wins, right? And that's this narcissistic flaw that we can have if we're not careful. Not only just because that's not the way things actually work, and you're never as great as you think you are, but also, especially with AI, it's important to note that if you're honest with yourself, you have flaws. Okay? We all have flaws. And AI is going to amplify the living bejeebers out of it, especially if you go, well, let's just get rid of everybody and let's bring in 10 versions of me. You've now 10x'd those flaws. So while you think you've 10x'd your wins, you've also 10x'd your flaws as well. You've created 10x as many blind spots. Now, to just give a personal example of this, all right, those of you who know me know proximity is something that is not my thing. Okay, I'm not a big advocate for like why really do we need to be in the same room physically for things? And so most people who know me have never actually sat in the same room as me. Now I've made that work, but I am also aware of the fact that a world where everybody only operates the way Christopher thinks as it comes to proximity is not a healthy world. And I need people who can challenge and push against that and who have a real preference and lean into the strength of proximity and, really can work a room in person and will actually emphasize that. Where I'll de-emphasize it, they'll emphasize that. And over the years, I've intentionally built teams to balance that out. I've said, I know I don't have all the strengths. I know what my gaps are. So let's make sure I build a team that balances that out, that, counterbalances, where I'm weak, it is strong type of a thing. And this, from what I can tell, did not happen here. They literally said, here is Jason and everything Jason thinks. Let's build that up. Now, in a sales team, especially, that's extreme. I mean, it's dangerous everywhere, but just think about in a sales team, if you only have one type of salesperson, you are literally whittling down your opportunity pool. Because if you've only got you've completely eliminated diversity from your sales team. Sometimes you need the challenger that, from what I can tell from Jason, that's who he is. He'd be the deal closer, the pushy guy who tells you why you aren't going to make it if you don't have what I offer right now. Sometimes that is very much needed. Sometimes that will kill the deal. Sometimes that will turn away an entire population of people because they can't stand that version. And you need the person that can lean in, the one that's a little more empathetic, the one that can actually kind of get to know a person, is willing to play the long game and work that for things like that. And you naturally need that. Is as much as I appreciate the fact they created the workflows, you can't even say there's only one outbound workflow. Depending on who your target customer is, you may have different outbound ones. You may have different processes that you follow based on, hey, this is this kind of a lead. We need our AI to work with it. And you're not going to get that kind of nuance. That's the kind of nuance that a good sales leader has, where they know, oh, okay, this isn't working for Sally. We need to put this on Johnny so that they can, we just know personality wise, this is the kind of thing, or maybe it hasn't been working over here. We need to shift this over. If you just have one agent that just does this, as much as it seems like AI is dynamic, you got to remember it's not, unless you're really opening this up, which I would say is even a bigger risk, is if you just say, well, we'll just let the agent be whatever the customer wants. I posted about it earlier this week and I'm like, yeah, or last week, you knock yourself out with that and wait until you end up giving away all your product for free because your agent was so accommodating. It just literally met the needs of every single prospective customer you had. But I think you get my point, right? This idea that if you just have multiple extensions of yourself, it's better. It's not. It's actually a fatal flaw. Now, the other one that I would say is a big critique here, especially when you do something like you have completely wiped out your entire organization. Like, we're not talking they augmented and left a few people in place, or they just kind of trim things down, streamline some of their workflows. You completely wiped people out, which presents two big challenges. The first is this. Maybe, okay, they said they trained on 6 weeks of data. Fine, that's a tiny window, but whatever. Great. Maybe it captured all the innovation, everything that they're going through in that moment. Anybody who's worked in any organization for any period of time knows that there's seasonality, there's economic factors, there's a million different things happening that shift what goes on. And humans adapt to this kind of stuff. They quickly shift. They can change their playbook. They realize the playbook that was working before isn't working anymore, and they can write a new playbook. AI is not going to do that. Their agents are not going to do that. Their agents are not going to suddenly, they may be able to make micro adaptations. Maybe it's trained on how to overcome some objectives or objections. And so as they're sitting talking to somebody, they can pivot and maybe try different things. But when it comes to rewriting the playbook, because, hey, the pipelines run dry, like people are not interested in our product anymore, those agents are just going to keep hammering round pegs through square holes, and they're not going to pivot. And there's no human agents, there's no human people left to go, we got to rewrite the playbook. We got to come up with a whole new playbook. Humans innovate through happy accidents and improv. They adapt to market shifts. The economy tanks, a new competitor enters the market. The agent's just going to keep running the same old play. It's been optimized for the present at the cost of the future. And that's a huge opportunity cost. Now, where this critique gets even worse is that because Jason and his team decided we're going to do this and make this move and eliminate all humans from the process, where this gets worse is all of that accountability of these things that were lost now falls on Jason and his chief AI officer's shoulders. Now, Jason may have at one point, he built the company, may have been a salesperson. I guarantee he has not been a salesperson for a while. My guess is while he probably still thinks, well, I'm in meetings, I'm closing deals all the time. He's not a salesperson anymore. He hasn't been for a long time, and he's probably rusty and plenty. He's now taken on the accountability and responsibility of that entire organization. And this is something that happens all the time that people forget about. AI can't be accountable for anything. So that accountability just shifted. And not just the accountability of like some tasks, like when you lose a person in your team and the team kind of has to pick up the work while you figure out what to do. No, you literally took the entire sales organization and plopped it in the CEO's lap, who, mind you, is supposed to be focused on very, very, very different things. And you might say, well, but doesn't he have the help of the chief AI officer? Yeah, who also is not a salesperson. So you've now not only compounded this, well, we did this based on a snapshot in time. We've now nerfed ourselves for the future, but we've now also shifted all the accountability of identifying when we need a new playbook. What factors have contributed to the needs of that new playbook? Have we been experimenting with anything in the middle? Are there any things that we can do? Even if you say, well, our agents are designed to learn along the way, who's looking at what they're doing to determine? It's an innovation death spiral. It truly is. And they're not going to feel it at first. At first, it's going to feel totally fine. It's going to go, things are running smooth. We moved everybody over to this. I would set my watch that the timer's ticking down and it's like, yep, sounds great for now. You just watch the way this moves. And I would take a bet on how long before they're quietly reversing course, trying to hire people back, shutting down their agents, maybe having the agents work on specific tasks while people are working alongside them. It's only a matter of time is what I'll say. Now, to close things out, let's say this. So now what? Okay, maybe you've made it this far in the episode and you're going, well played, Christopher. I hear where you're coming from. So what can I do in response to this? What are 3 takeaways that I can walk away from this autopsy from? I think the first one would be this. If you have natural attrition, which you're going to, people are going to quit. You're going to have to riff people, like whatever, it happens. Don't backfill immediately. wait. Take the time to evaluate what that person was doing. Did it need to be done? Is there a percentage of that work that can be automated before you hire a human? And there may be people who don't want to hear that, who go, "What, Christopher, you're advocating to not replace people." I'm not advocating that you don't replace people. I'm saying take a strategic look and determine, do you actually need another person? And if so, is it doing the same things they were doing before? Maybe you still do need another person, but maybe you need a completely different person because the work that person was doing is no longer value add or should be completely automated, which actually now gives you room to take this headcount and use it for something of more strategic value. But you're never going to know that if you don't take that 30-day vacancy rule and go, you know what, before we even open the rec again, let's spend 30 days actually analyzing what this was, what do we need, and how do we proceed? The second one is to really take an audit of the voice of what you're trying to do and how you're thinking about automation, because the narcissistic error is a dangerous one, and we often forget. I don't know if it's forget or we just don't even see it, but we just have to believe. And if you don't believe me, just ask your friends, okay? Or at least the ones that'll tell you the truth. More versions of you is not a good thing. And if me saying that makes you angry, tough. We don't need more of you. And that's not because you're not valuable. It's that we don't just need multiple clones of you. And that is the biggest mistake. One of the biggest mistakes people make with AI is they just create extensions of themselves and think it's a great thing, because we like to think of ourselves as valuable, and we are valuable. We do add value, but you only need one Christopher Lind. You don't need 2 of them. You don't need 5 of them. You certainly don't need 10 of them, type of a thing. But you actually have to believe that. And if you don't, you're going to end up using AI to create replications of yourself. And it's not just going to be your sales agents. It's going to be, you're going to create, we really love the bad cop or the good cop, or like whatever it is. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. That's just the reality of things. So don't do that. Actually analyze what you need and believe diversity is a good thing. You have to believe that foundational belief. So those would be the 2 things that I would say, just like if you're walking away from this, walk away with that. And really, we've got to break in 2026. We've got to stop asking the question, can AI do this job? The answer is no, it can't. It might be able to do some tasks, but it cannot do anybody's job. Anybody who thinks AI can do a job does not know how that job works. So we have to stop trying to make that happen. And we need to start asking, what parts of this work could AI do? And should it do those things? And actually do that investigative work and be wise and strategic and not make emotional decisions about how we use AI. Because we already saw in 2025 that when we do that, it doesn't end well. And we don't need more of that in 2026 and moving forward. And if you need help, please, I specialize in this. Reach out. I would love to work with you and help you think through these things. Ask the questions that you don't know to ask. Say the things that you need to hear but maybe don't want to hear, type of a thing. I'd love to chat. So you know how to find me. But with that, thanks for listening, and we will see you on the other side.